Hello and welcome. I'm Yamini, joined today by Paul Vorbach from Academy Global. We're talking about strategic risk management and why it's become so critical for organizations right across Australia and New Zealand. We'll unpack this idea of the polycrisis, look where the region is most exposed, and talk about how leaders can actually respond. So, Paul, to set the scene, we keep hearing this word polycrisis. What does it mean, and why does strategic risk management matter so much more now than it used to?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question because risk management's become a lot more complicated in the last couple of decades. We often hear about this term a VUCA environment, a volatile, uncertain, constantly changing environment. And as a result of that, what we see is an interplay between risks, which creates the conditions known as a polycrisis. So once upon a time, the risk environment tended to be somewhat more linear. The order of magnitude of interrelated risks has become greater, and that includes a bit of a confluence between cyber risks, climate and environmental risks, geopolitical risks, and even increasingly the psychosocial related risks as well, which speak largely to challenges in terms of the workforce environment. Now, whilst these can all be considered as discrete risks, the overlapping and the interconnectedness means that they influence each other and therefore can expand both in terms of likelihood and also the level of impact which they have on the consequence scale as well. So the polycrisis really refers to those multiple interrelated and interacting risks, which makes the management of risks far more challenging than what we see in other more discrete environments.
Where's Australia and New Zealand most exposed right now? And walk us through the biggest fronts.
So Australia and New Zealand have often benefited from this notion of the tyranny of distance, sometimes having geographic distance between these two countries, and particularly the more volatile areas, especially the Middle East, but previously parts of across Asia and into Eastern Europe as well. We've sort of, in some respects, been quite comfortable, particularly from a geopolitics proximity. But because of supply chain disruption, because of increasingly intensifying centres of geographic supply, think about silicon chips, think about rare earth materials. These concentration risks have flowed through to all organisations globally. So from an Australian and New Zealand perspective, the risks themselves aren't especially unique. It's just that the traditional insulation that we were probably more more frequently used to benefiting from has largely been removed. So we face the same sorts of influences, same sorts of complex problems as other parts of the world. There is probably one area of significant departure from that, and that's probably where it comes to questions of food security. So fortunately for Australia in particular, and also New Zealand, food security is less of a challenge in our geographies because of the breadth of the agricultural and primary sectors here.
And so, given how interconnected they are, how should leaders actually respond?
So the traditional ways of responding to risks in organisations is largely driven by the nature of the core purpose of the organisation. So banks and insurance companies, for example, use very advanced financial modelling and statistical analysis to work out, what risks are likely to be associated with weather events or health conditions affecting populations. When it comes to risk management in a more traditional manufacturing environment, then the risks often relate to things like supply chain risks. They also relate to concerns around work, health and safety, and independent of the nature of organisational activity, financial risks and reputational risks will always be present in addition. Now, the traditional models for approaching what we call the enterprise risk management are well established. And in fact, Australia was a leading contributor to the development of the international risk management standard, the ISO 31000. Now, what has changed dramatically in the polycrisis environment is that the need to look increasingly outside of the industry, of the geography, of the whole sovereign that an organisation is operating in becomes an increasingly important imperative. And the tools that we use for this, like scenario planning, like risk radars, like hypothetical modelling, game theory, become increasingly important when there's higher levels of uncertainty. So that's what we're really seeing in terms of polycrisis, is the need for more strategic risk tools and frameworks. And they, for many organisations, are a new discipline and a new process.
And Paul, coming to my final question, for leaders wanting to build that capability, where should they start?
So most organisations have a moderate level of maturity when it comes to understanding what we might describe as the fundamentals of risk management. So understanding how to go through a process of identifying particularly operational risks, those ones which are most visible to an organisation and clearest to see. And those risks also tend to be those for which the organisation has some track record and history in being able to deal with that. So I think the base level of capability in fundamental risk management is of a, generally of a quite high order. The main difference then comes down to how evolving environments like the polycrisis environment need to impact capabilities. And that's where an organisation like Academy Global or other professional organisations who build capability don't simply provide consulting services, and they help to distribute knowledge and understanding of how to look for these more complex external arrangements that don't have these same linear characteristics.
That's a useful way to think about the emerging risks and the challenging environment we live in. So, Paul, thank you so much for explaining that to us. And thank you all for joining.